During the winter this year, I had agreed to attend a short camping trip with a small group of my friends. The trip was only intended to last a long weekend from Friday until Monday, when we would travel back home during the evening. Two of my friends, Elizabeth and David, are quite avid campers, and thus were well prepared to supply us with the majority of our necessities, including all equipment we should have needed to stave the cold that was typical to such a time of year. My other friend, Lee, whom I was intended to share a tent with, would provide our two-man, while Elizabeth and David slept within their own tent. Our campsite resided deep within a woodland that was bare of leaves and heavy with shrubbery and thickets that bordered the pathway. The clearing we had found lay about a quarter of a mile in, and we had spent some time clearing the immediate area of rock and deadwood as we set our camp. By the time we had set a fire and our dinner was cooking, the mulch beneath our feet had begun to crisp and freeze, and the sky above was pink and clear and offered us no shelter from the cold air. To be honest, I had begun to regret accepting my friend's invitation by that point, realizing our night would surely be filled with discomfort in the form of the cold, even with the preparations made. Still, we had played a few games of cards after dinner and then retired to our tents, wrapped in our warmest clothes, excluding our coats and boots to stave the chill, while outside the dying fire had cracked and popped as I settled down to sleep beside Lee. That night, I had awoken several times without obvious reason. I think it had been the unusual sounds of the woodland nightlife being in such close proximity to me, and the general discomfort of sleeping somewhere unfamiliar that had caused me such unrest, really. The next morning had brought terribly crisp air and hot drinks and food, and we had huddled into Elizabeth and David's tent while we ate our breakfast. The day thereafter had been spent exploring the woodland and hiking along a trail until we'd reached a riverbank, before we had returned to our campsite where we'd rebuilt the fire and then spent the late afternoon and early evening cooking and chatting. I found I came to quite enjoy myself in my friend's company after all, despite the abject misery the cold usually brought me. That evening, however, once the sun had set and the forest floor began to frost over once more, I had stood from the camping chair that had been designated as mine and excused myself from the group, intending to find a private place away from the light of the fire to use the toilet. To the east of our campsite, and in the opposite direction that our car was parked, had been a dense copse of young trees and shrubbery that allowed for a relative amount of privacy. I had continued along a fairly flat animal path for a short distance once I had passed the copse, until I could no longer hear the voices of my friends before relieving myself in the dark and then intending to follow the firelight back to our camp. But when I had turned in what I had thought was the direction I had come in, I could no longer see a light in front of me. We had built the fire up considerably high that evening, and when I had been leaving the campsite, the faintest glow of the firelight had still reached me even from behind the copse that now I could no longer see at all. I had turned again, scanning the area around me for the orange light of our fire upon the trees or flickering through the undergrowth, but I could see nothing. It was a moonless night and thus completely pitch black. I hadn't brought a torch, thinking I'd only be a few yards away from our clearing, but now, without a single source of light from which I might orientate myself, I found I suddenly had no idea where I was at all. Worry had struck me, though I had kept from panicking, and knowing my friends were close and I could simply call out to them, which is what I had prepared to do, just as, out of the corner of my eye, I had caught sight of a faint light. Finally, I saw the firelight flickering through the bare undergrowth, warm and inviting in the cold that was beginning to seep into my bones after being away from the heat for quite a while now. Immediately I had stepped towards it, finding myself wading through tall grass and brambles and apparently away from the animal path, but perhaps I just veered off in my confusion. The firelight shone through what must have been a large bush or thicket of some sort, its illumination sparse and glinting through dense moving branches or evergreen needles. It must have been the copse I'd initially passed, which made sense and surely meant I would be back within the campsite shortly. I still couldn't hear the voices of my friends, but perhaps they'd just quietened down. And then, quite suddenly, while I had been attempting to edge my way around the copse that blocked my path, I had lost sight of the firelight completely. I had paused in my movement, attempting to shift where I stood to find an angle from which I might see the light again, so as not to lose my direction, but it was as if the light had just winked out in a second. I tried to remain in the direction I had been facing, but to get around the copse I had needed to weave through low branches and brambles sharp enough to pierce through my trousers. I'd done it anyway, sure I'd see the firelight again if I could just get to the other side of the copse. I had begun to shiver by then, my fingers numb without gloves and my joints beginning to ache as the cold stiffened them. I could still see no light of the fire and was ready to begin calling for my friends when suddenly it had appeared again, flickering and to my right when I had been so sure it should have been at my left. I had changed my direction to follow the light again, this time with a renewed hurry in my pace and a little more determination behind myself. I didn't do well in the cold. It was the main reason I'd been reluctant to join my friends for this trip in the first place, and I was already quite tired from a fairly exhausting day and the late hour. I wanted to get back to the campsite. I wanted to warm myself beside the fire and then promptly go to bed, but the firelight seemed to be getting no closer despite my haste, and then I had tripped and tumbled on a rock concealed in the undergrowth. I'd managed to catch myself on my hands and knees, but the thorns of some of the brambles had pierced the skin of my palms, and my right knee had taken much of the impact, immediately beginning to throb and possibly swell a little. I had gotten to my feet by the aid of a sturdy trunk of a tree, hissing and gritting my teeth through the pain amplified in the cold. The fire seemed further away than ever now, as if I were going round in circles or trying to catch up to something that was moving faster than me. I knew, logically, I must have been falling victim to some sort of hopelessness born from fatigue and the ache the cold brought, and that surely the distance was simply a trick of the forest around me and how it concealed the light. I continued on, this time at a slower pace, and slight limp to keep some of the weight off of my newly injured knee, and finally I called for my friends. First for Lee, and then for David and Elizabeth, and for a few moments after I stood in the silence of the woods listening for a reply. But nothing came. There was no indication at all that my friends had heard me. I called again, but still only silence answered as I walked through the cold, and my eyes trained on that flickering light, determined not to lose it again. I had continued as such for some time, limping and calling occasionally for my friends, for help. The air, I was sure, was growing colder, sharp in my throat and stinging my eyes and nose. I could no longer feel my hands, even tucked beneath my coat, and my footsteps had grown heavy and clumsy with my numb feet and frozen joints. I could no longer feel much of the pain from my knee, though I wasn't sure if that was good or not, and the tiredness that had weighed down my mind and limbs was now threatening to draw my eyelids shut. I thought perhaps if I could just rest for a few moments, that if I could sit down I might find a renewed energy to continue on. Surely my friends were only a short distance away now. I wasn't sure how long I'd been walking for, but I hadn't gone far from the campsite, and if I could just rest for a moment, I would find my friends soon, surely. Slowly and steadily, so as not to aggravate my knee, I had lowered myself down by the aid of a tree to sit amongst the ground ivy and frozen mulch. My eyelids were still so heavy, and my extremities so cold that I had allowed myself the slight relief of curling up and leaning back against the tree, closing my eyes for just a moment. I would get up soon. I finally relaxed a little against the tense shivering I had endured for what felt like hours now, no doubt tiring me even more. And then, in my new stationary position, I finally felt myself beginning to warm a little. I was so tired, and the silence of the night now seemed so calming. I would get up again soon.